Hey everybody, my name is Ming Chang Yang. My sign name looks like this and I'm on the face. Welcome to our very first webinar, and our topic is called Saving Face. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention a few points. We've got panels here, and they are not experts. The topic that we are talking about is going to be based on our personal experience. If you guys have any questions, there is an option to type in the chat box, and you guys can go ahead and type some questions in the chat box. If you want to add closed captioning, there is an option at the bottom portion of your screen to click closed caption, and you can turn that on or off. All right, we're going to go ahead and start our panel. I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists. Please come on the screen. Thank you guys so much for coming. We're going to go ahead and start. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and introduce yourself, what your career is, where you were born, where you moved from, how old you were when you moved here.
Hi, my name is Jane Kim. I am Korean American or Asian American. I was born in Korea at 1, moved here to America, so I consider myself 1.75 generation. And I work at the California School for the Deaf in Riverside.
Hi, my name is Darian, and I consider myself a Filipino American. I am a 3rd generation. Right now I'm living in Riverside. Originally, I was born in the military, or my family was in the military, and so I'm a military brat. I grew up in the Bay Area. We moved here to Riverside, California, so that I could go to school. I just recently graduated from University of California in Riverside, and I got my bachelor's degree in psych, and I have a minor. Currently, I'm working in a research lab. I'm doing data managing, and then I'm also working to try to get into a master's program.
All right, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with you all. So I am Indian deaf queer, born and raised in New York, in Long Island. Now I live in Southern California, Los Angeles. I work as an engineer and as a deaf interpreter, and I'm very excited to be here with you all. My name is Jaron George.
Ming Chin here. I just wanted to go ahead and explain some of my role. I was born in Taiwan. I moved here when I was 3. I grew up here in California. I've been here for most of my life. For a lot of my career, I was a teacher in a mainstream program. And so thank you everyone for coming. We're really excited to talk about some of our personal experiences today. We've spent a lot of time thinking, but I was curious, what has your identity and journey been like as a deaf Asian American? And this is Darian here. I'll go ahead and start. And really, I grew up Asian and I grew up deaf, but both of those identities were very separate from each other. Being that I am a 3rd generation family member of an Asian community, I didn't really feel like I connected very much with my Asian community. Being Filipino, the traditions, the history, I didn't know much about the language growing up. In my school, we did have some other Asian people there, but I didn't really spend much time with them. Being Asian wasn't very popular, so not until my 2nd year of college, I had 2 international roommates. One was Korean and the other one was Chinese. We spent some time sharing our space, the culture and the foods that we ate, and it talked about learning and wanting to learn more about the Asian community and Asian culture. With my deaf identity, I was born hard of hearing, but I grew up mainstream, and not until I didn't really like being hard of hearing. It was very isolating, and I had a hard time socializing with friends, being that I couldn't hear. That was hard. And it wasn't until I had moved here to Riverside that I had met my first deaf person, and then decided later that I wanted to learn American Sign Language, that I wanted to go and take some classes. And the original school that I was at didn't offer ASL classes. And so at that time I was learning American Sign Language, and I had felt like I had found my community. I had found a language that I could use. But both my identities really didn't mix and didn't combine later until I had found SCADA. There was one person who had suggested that I look up the organization, and I thought, that might be cool. I mean, I did want to meet more Asian deaf people. And so eventually I did find SCADA, and I went to a social group and recognized that it was really easy communicating with everybody. And now being on the board, it feels like my family.
Right. So I like how Darren talked about their identity, and that's something I'd like to get into a little bit later. I feel like I've had an awkward experience in my identity. I grew up in an immigrant family in New York, and my older sister is deaf, and we did have access to communication at home. And the Lexington School for the Deaf is where I went to school from third grade and on. And there was a very diverse population of students there. So I was already involved in multiple different communities. But in regards to the Asian community, it was interesting because I would arrive home and have to disavow my deaf identity. And when they would ask me about school, I would say it's okay. But then older, when I started going to mainstream schools and Rochester Institute for Technology, I was involved in a deaf club, and there were a lot of deaf Asian people there. So I went to this event, and there were a lot of white people. There weren't a lot of people with the same color as me, and it didn't feel like home. So I left. And at that point, deaf and queer identities were there, but I still haven't really connected to Asian identities yet. So then I moved to California, and there's a very strong Latinx community here. And a lot of my friends are involved in different communities, and I've seen a lot of uh, grassroots communities and a lot of intersectionality between the Latino and deaf cultures here. And it's very beautiful. It's interesting. But I thought, what does mine look like? What does my Asian culture look like? I haven't really processed that yet. So it's been a pretty rough journey, actually, trying to discover what it means to be a deaf Asian person. So that's still something that I'm in the journey of or process of. I haven't found that out yet, but here I am.
Hi, this is Jane here. So I moved here when I was 1. Really, same as what Darian was saying. I had a deaf identity and a Korean identity. When I was home, I was strong Korean culture. My family didn't know English at the time. They had just moved here. When I went to deaf school in Orange County, or it was part of a deaf program in Orange County, there was a lot of, for me, it was a very confusing time. I have another deaf sister, and that helped a lot in terms of finding my identity. But really, I consider myself kind of like a banana, yellow on the outside, but on the inside white. And that's just me being honest. Being around a lot of deaf and white people, I kind of just became that deaf identity. So then in high school, there was a large Asian population, but still I was embarrassed. Like I didn't really feel like I connected with them. The language, the culture, I didn't really understand. When I went to CSUN for undergrad, that's where I I felt like I could be really deaf and maintain my deaf identity. My sister went to RIT and became involved with NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, in Washington, D.C. And, at that time, I didn't have a lot of money. For my birthday, they paid for me to fly and go visit in Washington, D.C. And I just was that experience had just woken me up. There was a lot of Asian people, and there was another conference in San Francisco which had even more people, and I just got connected with a lot of people who had the same types of experiences and struggles as I did. And so from then on, I just really identified as an Asian deaf person, and that was amazing.
Being here, it is so interesting how all of your experiences and even my personal experience too, like we've found our identities quite later in life. It never really started whenever we were younger. And it's nice to know our identities now, isn't it? It's so interesting. All right, so now let's start our first poll. Are you guys ready? Should be popping up here. I don't see it. There it is. Great. Give it a few more minutes. I think everybody's done. Okay. I see that there are a high percentage of you guys. Oh. Sorry. Okay, I see there are a majority of you guys that are from Southern California. 48% of you, and then from Northern California, 7% of you, and then those of you guys outside of California, 38%. And even outside of the US, 7% of you guys. Wow, some international
That's so cool.
people are watching. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So it's nice to share. Thanks for sharing, you guys. So what I've all noticed is that there are some similarities. And one of the similarities that we have is called saving face. And so I'm just curious, what do you interpret saving face to mean?
Jaren here. For me, in regards to saving face, or that term saving face, there's an underlying meaning, especially in regards to Asian cultures. Uh, and what that looks like is really dependent on which specific culture we're discussing, and how that culture is shaped in society, how that all works out. But saving face, the English words here, the term face, to me, it means the reputation of your family, your heritage. It's that name that you were attached to. Now, in regards to the word saving, uh, that's a matter of protecting that name. So once you put them both together, you get the term saving face. And that word helps us to really think about and discuss the occurrences that happen in our home, within our families, at our home countries, or just within the Asian community here internationally. And with a little bit of research I found, I found that there are three different types of discussions. The first one being, or as related to emotion. And there's a variety, there's a scale to it. You know, there's one end of the spectrum being pride and the other being shame. The second topic, or the second grouping, being how a person typically responds to situations. For example, if there's a situation where I have to have bad news given, or I have to tell bad news, I have to have some type of smile, and that seems overly positive. But that's a little example. The third example, or the third grouping, would be behavior, essentially, how that works into your mind. How does that affect your everyday judgments, your decisions, how you interact with people, how you raise children, family, your neighborhood, your community, everything like that. And I believe all these contribute to the idea of saving face. And I'd like to discuss how that looks like in my home, how I grew up with my family, and in my country.
This is Darian here. Also, I do want to add, and maybe just an example of what saving face might look like, or maybe what it would feel like. I imagine that maybe you're having a conversation with somebody, but you can't fully understand the conversation. Maybe you've missed something, but you tend to respond by nodding your head, or maybe if it's humorous, you might laugh. And if you realize that you respond that way, it could be because you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to show any embarrassment. And that would be a type of saving face. But maybe there's a different reason. Maybe the conversation is significant and you wouldn't be saving face. Like, not saving face could look like different things within your behavior.
This is Jane here. Similar to what they both have said, what saving face means, for me specifically, it's like your strategy of how you're going to save your pride, save your name, save your honor. That's what it's correlated to me, to avoid embarrassment, to avoid just public embarrassment, any conflicts or issues. It's the idea that's set on Confucianism, like Taoism as well. And Buddhism. All of those are kind of correlated. So if you're in a collective environment, our lives and everything, are all of us together are good, then our emotions and our spirit will be good. So for myself, I can't really be vulnerable, or if I am, then that would be considered weak. And so I've got to put on a front and, show strength and say that I can. And that's correlated to saving face. So showing the world that we have everything, or we can do everything. And then also face has value. In the culture, face is a very strong idea. Similar to palm reading, it's the same concept. The face to me is the same concept. It says the same thing. Your education, education level, status, your communication your communication to the world without saying anything at all.
Jaren here again. Also, I would like to add a very strong part about how that's embedded in Asian communities. So here in the States, being a son of immigrants, my home, there's a lot of negotiations between American culture, things that we learn from TV. Once we go out and about, if we're playing basketball or we're socializing at the pool, and then we learn these things and we come home. And then there's conflict of what we were learned in our own culture. So, for example, within my culture, there's a strong emphasis on using your right hand. Your right hand's used for eating, money, gift giving, serving drinks, whereas your left hand is related to things such as bathroom using, cleaning. But here in the States, the toilets are different, or how everything works is different. And I realized this difference because I'm left-handed. So here, my family would see me eating with my left hand, and they'll tell me that I shouldn't do that. But at the schools said that was fine. So, and my family, they decided that they shouldn't say no because that would create a conflict. So growing up, eating Indian food with my left hand was totally fine at home. But then we went to India, the whole family and I, and we would eat, and I would reach for the food with my left hand, and then someone would smack my hand and say, "Oh, no, 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 eat with your right hand." And I thought, oh, that's interesting because I'm left-handed, and there was a feeling of conflict. So I actually had to sit on my left hand to force myself to use my right hand to eat. And I felt that, even though my parents knew that I was left-handed, and they knew that there's a different culture that I was raised in, they still didn't want to have me bring shame to the family by eating with my left hand. And that's a form of saving face. They didn't want my parents didn't want to hear anyone talking about me eating with my left hand. But here in the States, even though I was with my Indian friends and family, they all understood. But in the homeland, it didn't happen that way. So to avoid the embarrassment, I, in effect, had to save their face. So that's something I learned when we go to India. I have to make a lot of adjustments, a lot of essentially negotiations with myself. Another example, American culture is very strong when it comes to touching. Women to women, that's fine. Men with other men, not so much. But in India, women can touch women, that's fine. But it is expected that men are able to talk with other men and hold hands and things like that for hours at a time. That's considered normal there. So I was talking with a man and they held my hand and I pulled my hand back saying, "Oh, what's going on?" And then I realized, oh no, that's normal here. So that was a differing experience for me. So there's a lot of differences between cultures and how we negotiate them.
And this is Jane here. Similar idea with my family. Saving face and how I resonate with that is my parents in Korean culture. If they have deaf children, they have two deaf children, my sister and I are both deaf, that's considered as God's punishment to them, that there was something wrong that they've done in their past life. And both my parents took that very hard. They went through a very difficult time having two deaf kids. And so, generally, in our history, if something's wrong with your kids, if they're deaf, if they're blind, or a variety of other things, they're typically left on the street. And that's just historical. I mean, in the 50s or 70s, that's typically what happened. And I asked my father, why did you not do that with me? And he said, well, you were my child. And one time that somebody was pitying him or pitying us for being deaf, and he confronted that. And instead, what he did was push us to be, myself, my sister and I, to be more successful. And for us to not be would be a failure, not just to ourselves, but to them and in their eyes, for their family, for our family name. And so all of these kind of responsibilities pile up on each other. There are different layers. And so for us to, that was essentially saving face for us.
Being here, yeah, I can definitely relate to those types of experiences, because I even remember looking back when I was younger, I was really fascinated. So I was deaf when I was younger, and I was in deaf identity. And I remember I had a teacher who taught me sign language, and my parents said, no, you should not sign. And my hands were slapped, and I was told that I had to learn to speak. I had to be proficient enough to be able to speak. And for me to have access to language, that was hard. So I realized that whenever I arrived home and I would be trying to play by using sign language, if my parents caught me signing, I would be punished. They would use a ruler. I would have to set my hands out in front of me, and they would slap my hands with the ruler. And from that experience, I really had a lot of trauma. I was never able to accept my deaf identity. I had to follow Asian culture. I had to be a proficient speaker. And that was tough. That was tough because I was saving face for my family, which was a huge obligation. And that caused us stress on me. And it's crazy to see our obligation. And that's not easy to save other people's faces. So Darren, go ahead. Darian here. So I think it is very interesting, because from my experience being a third generation Asian person in my family, my family didn't have that expectation for me. Really, your family's expectations to fit in or to be normal are interesting. But my parents were part of the military, and my father had expected me to be good and get good grades. But I was never expected to live up to some sort of reputation. But I was supposed to take care of myself and take care of my future. And so it's really interesting how there is a range for each individual person, whether you have generational obligations or not. It's really interesting.
Jaron here. I think that's a very interesting experience with raising a family while being immigrants. Uh, when it comes to having deaf children, you really have to prove your worth. You have to prove and earn your family's reputation. You have to prove that it's not a quote unquote punishment from God. And just off my own experience, here, my sister, she's my older sister. She's also deaf, but she was raised orally, meaning she's essentially the exact opposite of me. She wears hearing aids. She speaks very well. She can assimilate with the hearing community. Very different from me. I'm actually very opposite of her. So she's the oldest. I'm the second. But my parents were not too embarrassed. My sister picked up language very well. She picked up how to speak very well, but I was more of a visual learner. My parents tried using hearing aids, cochlear implants, teaching me how to speak. Even though I would be in college and I would be on break, I would come home, they would ask me, how's my speech going? How's my hearing going? Instead of asking me about how am I actually doing? So this is a matter of how am I saving my family's face in regards to language. I also have a younger brother who's born 5 years after me. My parents had him hearing tested, and they realized that there's a blessing, realizing that, or essentially that he's a blessed son. I'm sorry, his name is a blessing, and that puts so much stress on me. And that expectation uh, that my brother had, check that off. My sister was also able to speak well, check that off. But when it came to me, I had to make this decision to leave my family and to put that back on them because I don't feel that I'm a part of them anymore. So saving face helped me realize this experience and why this is happening, and to understand my parents and the multi-generational trauma of how their parents and their grandparents and so on and so forth down the generations put that expectation on the younger generations. It doesn't always work if your child has what would be called, well, it's an issue of a horizontal identity. So, for example, I'm born here's me. I'm Indian, just like my family. That would be vertical. We are the same, and that goes passed down. But I'm also deaf. But if they were deaf, that would still be vertical. But my parents, to me, we are not the same. So instead of being vertical, that would be considered horizontal. So that was a big difference for my parents, and that identity brought shame. So, and then it's double the effect for me because I'm deaf and also queer. So that was a big experience. And they felt that my sister essentially made it and my little brother essentially made it. But then here I am, and there's still this ongoing struggle. And it's very heavy to really think about. But the multi-generational trauma is a very important thing to keep in mind. And as children of immigrants who were born in the States, my parents didn't have access to English. They had access to essentially what's considered broken English. And then on top of that, teaching children how to adapt becomes more difficult. So then essentially it was a matter of the siblings raising each other, going to school, learning what we learned there, taking that home, and working through it that way. But all this is in the name of the family. So there is a lot of trauma to unpack.
Yes, Jane here. Similar to what Chen said, it's the same for, within Asian culture, the concept of being perfect and making it look like everything's okay. So having a shame-based and a guilt-based culture, what does that mean? That's the opposite. And Asians tend to not want to lose their respect from other people, while Americans don't want to lose the respect of the self. And so that conflicts with each other. So everything's an opposite. And so when you're talking about being confused about where my identity lies, some of us have, developed some sort of kind of way to adapt to whatever is being confronted in front of them. So you think about mental health issues as well, and I'm sure some of you already know what the word means, imposter syndrome. And I think that applies to all cultures, but specific to the Asian culture, trying to feeling like I'm smart and feeling competent, but at the same time being worried about being not competent and trying to excel and be noticed. And, a lot of people, Asian people, try and find success in academics. They go to college at the bachelor's level, they feel like they're good from there. But how does that, how do they confront their trauma and the things, the emotions that they haven't really confronted? And so that's where I'm kind of feeling that conflict. And going back to the concept of shame and guilt, we can challenge, or the Western culture, we challenge that. And Western culture is always saying, come on, be close to us. But we're kind of in the middle, the same concept as those who are hard of hearing, or, they feel like they're in the middle, like there's either deaf or hearing, but they're kind of in the middle. And I think within Asian culture, I think there can be also a middle as well. What do you think?
Yeah, this is Jaren here. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and this is Darian here. I mean, especially relating to that experience, I am hard of hearing and I am Asian. And so I do feel like, and then especially bringing in that saving face, I feel like it is related more to being hard of hearing, because even this type of discussion, what we're talking about, like I remember Christy had asked me if I wanted to join, and I thought, I don't know, I can't quite save enough. Or I can't quite sign well enough. Will the interpreters understand me? I really felt like I had to maybe practice a lot to be a part of this discussion. And then I recognized that I'm hard of hearing and I'm Asian. And I realized that I formed my own expectations that I needed to live up to. And maybe those are different from other people. And I know that some people, they, tell me their experiences and they tell me, oh no, you do sign good enough, Darian. And to me, I don't feel like it's good enough. And I'm not sure why. And maybe that's related to the imposter syndrome, or maybe it's related to the fact that I just don't feel, I feel like I'm more English based rather than ASL based. But I do see all these different stories and I hear everybody's experiences, and they're very valid.
Jaren here. That makes me wonder if the Asian part of our identity causes us to be more easy to internalize shame. Your comment makes me realize that we really do internalize a lot of shame. And the idea of consistency, we have to go to school, we have to satisfy everybody else. And then once we get our degree, okay, then we're good. But we still internalize all that shame. And then that all just ends up being bottled up and it's still there. And then that would end up becoming imposter syndrome.
Yes, Darian here. And I don't know what your guys' perspectives are, but like being Asian in school, I had a teacher that had expected more from me. And a teacher that was, asking me to have better grades. Or even in my American Sign Language class, people were saying, you're born here, you know English. And I said, yeah, I do know English. But it's still hard to learn other languages. And there's all these different expectations based on who you're interacting with. And this is Ming here, especially when you're talking about that whole thing about learning English. Like it is hard to recognize sometimes. Like sometimes people ask you, well, aren't you born here or were you born in another country? And I feel like everybody tends to assume, and really we shouldn't assume. You really should try to get to know a person first and realize where they come from. And speaking of, I do have another poll. I am curious where the audience is, and I've got another poll. Here it comes. Oh, race and ethnicity. Wow. Okay, seems like 81% of the audience is Asian. And then 4% of you are Black, and we have 7% of you are Pacific Islander, 11% are Latino, Latinx. Great. That's great. And then also I have a third poll. You guys ready? Oh, so do you think you've experienced having to save face before? Yeah, 78% of you guys say yes, 6% say no, 13% of you guys say maybe, and 3% say it does not apply. Wow, what good results. So I just want to thank you guys for sharing, and I'm sure you guys are wondering why it's important to discuss this topic. And so now let's ask our panelists, why is this important?
This is Jane here. I think it's important to discuss this issue because I've noticed that a lot of people that I socialize with, deaf Asians, especially young people too, I feel like they don't really know their identity. And also, they might be confused about living in the deaf world along with their Asian culture or whatever culture they come from. And so there's a lot of struggles. Like, for example, white people tend to say, "Oh, you're deaf, not you're deaf," and I am, uh, and then I'm trying to follow my culture and be deaf, and so it just causes a lot of issues. So for the same, like in education, being going through my education process and becoming licensed, and then feeling like not good enough necessarily is because I've got to be the same as them. If I don't follow what they're doing, or if I'm at their level or at their level, even with my background and everything, even if I'm so successful, Asian people, don't tend to give as much notice to that. But just noticing different cultures and having this discussion, it doesn't seem like the Asian culture talks about this often, this concept of saving face. We haven't been very vulnerable or showing our emotions, because a lot of the times we're seen as weak or emotional if we even process that. And so creating a safe place to dialogue that is really important. I think we touched on it a lot today. And I hope that we continue to have this discussion for deaf Asian people, both young and older generations. This is really critical for our future generations as well.
Jaren here. Yeah, I try to be involved in multiple communities, and I was involved with the Council de Manos, as well as the National Black Deaf Support uh, or Black Deaf Advocacy Group. And I went to multiple workshops, events, different things, and I see a lot of communal identities. And I noticed that there's within regards to their specific identity, there's a lot of influence between that racial identity and their deaf identity, as well as their other identities. And the whole discussion of what that all looks like when we take it all together. So I thought about that. I'm from India, Asian, uh, born. When I was growing up, I looked, where are the deaf Indian people at? And then by the time I was ready to really dissect that, I was here in Southern California. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. There were some opportunities, the Asian experience here in Southern California, but I felt at that time, I'm not ready. But then I realized that if the opportunity isn't there, then I have to start somewhere. So I started getting more involved with different communities, and uh, that's when I started to internalize everything that I saw. And that's when I decided to think about myself and think about where my identities intersect, and to essentially get rid of all the shame that I've internalized. So it's a very good discussion.
Darian here, I just want to add, like, we know that sharing our stories and sharing our experience is very valuable. And I think, especially related to this discussion, like bringing up issues and talking about education, I think that this is helpful to others, maybe others who don't know the right words. And so being able to label how you feel, I think can also help with how we are able to manage these issues that come up in the future. Like knowing what the issue is and knowing what the impact is, then you can learn how to fix it. And then you can also know what the expectation is. This is Ming. I agree with all of you guys. This is a great place to start this discussion, but at the same time, it's not easy to start a conversation like this. It is a process. And I've had several of my friends that, have encouraged me to be vulnerable, and I'm like, no. And again, it comes back to me trying to save face. And I know that it takes time, but I am thrilled. This is an incredible start. This is a good first step forward. And I really hope that this will help to guide others.
And this is Jane. I just want to bring up a big issue going on right now is the mental health issue. And so for us to have this open dialogue for young people that they're not alone and that they don't have to deal with this on their own. There's a lot of pressure from the media, from culture, with a lot of these different cultural and societal changes. So with mental health on the rise, we really need to put ourselves, out there and challenge these things and try and, get out of our comfort zone, out of our groups, and try and reach out to these people. So I really want to bring that to the table as well as super important.
Jaren here. I also want to thank SCADA for providing us with this platform, giving us the opportunity to put a spotlight on this discussion. And hopefully this starts other discussions that we can continue having dialogue and things like that. So I'm looking forward to what comes afterwards.
This is Ming. I definitely agree with you. And so I just wanted to I was just looking at the Q&A and I realized we have one more poll ready. Here it is. All right, so we got the results. 90% of you guys said that this conversation was beneficial. 3% said no. 6% of you said maybe, which that's great. That's all right. This could take time. Okay, so now we are ready for Q&A for some of the questions. You guys ready? Let's pull them up. Okay, the first one, it says, thank you so much for sharing your stories related to saving face, talking about your families. I am curious. Do you feel that as generations go on, saving face will continue to be passed through to your generation? This is Darian. I think that it's healthy to know when and why you are trying to save face. Like, for example, I had mentioned my past example about how to respond when you don't understand a conversation that you're a part of. And you could maybe you're responding by coping, and you are just trying to save yourself, and that's not always bad. But eventually it does start to impact your mental health and it can impact your relationships. And so I think that's when saving face can be bad. And so it's important to dig into yourself and figure out why.
Right. Also, to open up that question a little bit more. Oh, this is Jaren here, by the way. I also want to talk about the multi-generational trauma that we all experience and how a single individual can really think about how to break that down and find a safe place to have that discussion. So, for example, my family believes in arranged marriages. So about 2 years ago, with the man in India, my sister, my parents were wondering how they would run the show, and it's very interesting. They asked me to forego my identity. They would talk about me. They say, "Oh yes, he's deaf, he can't talk," and that's it. They don't want me to use my essentially my queer card. And I thought, okay. But then my sister, she refuses to do that. She wants to marry a man who accepts my identity, and that's a requirement. My parents, that's not a requirement for my parents. She would meet a man, say, okay, do you approve of my brother? If he says yes, then perfect. If not, okay, not going to work. And that's something that we can do to incite change for the newer generations. But it is an ongoing process.
Yes, I think they've said it all. This is Janie.
This is Ming. Okay, second question. How do you handle when you're in a hearing environment and someone is discriminating against your identity being deaf? How do you feel? Wait. Okay, let me repeat it. How do you deal with being in a hearing environment and when people are discriminating your identity being deaf or discriminating you for anything?
That's something I do need to think a little bit more about.
This is Jane. Is this the same concept about how deaf people deal with hearing people? Having to educate them and trying to save our deaf identity essentially, or our language, similar to Asian culture. In the same way, I try and tell people within the Asian culture, or tell people about the Asian culture the same way I would my deaf identity.
This is Darian here. I think that it's really important to find your community, be with people who don't discriminate against you, but do accept you for who you are. And then I also think it's important to have relationships and where you do feel supported and being in a community that also can support you and help you in many ways. It's really important to find different ways that you can help yourself as well.
Jaren here. So it really depends on who. So if they are not Asian, then I would just go ahead and forego it. But if they are Asian, yeesh, it really depends. Uh, of course, you have to respect your elders. That's integral to our cultures. And SCADA holds the Lunar New Year event. They recently just hosted that, and I went there. And as time got closer, I asked a friend of mine who's also queer if they can come with me. And they said, "Okay, sure, fine." So we went, and we were the only two queer people there that I knew of. So did I feel comfortable there? Not quite. Really depends. But then we went to introduce the husband, recently married, and they asked if I was married. And that's a typical South Asian, Middle Eastern thing to ask if you're married. If not, hey, I could introduce you to this beautiful woman. And I mean, there's a lot of diversity with the Asian community, but it's not extremely common to accept queer people. So I kind of forewent that question. So if it's an act of discrimination from an Asian person, I would have to say it really depends. If it's a strong elder recommendation, then not sure. But if I respond to that, then I would hurt their face essentially. So I really can't. I can't do that. So that's a difficult situation for us to navigate, but it is important to hold ourselves accountable. It does require a lot of sensitivity and a lot of uh, essentially holding things in too.
Thank you for that. Okay, so next question. How do you respond to people who ask you questions like where you're from. Like, how do you change the opening dialogue of that conversation? And this is Darian here. I would just say you just tell them directly. I'm from America, specifically California, specifically Southern California. And if they continue to ask me like what my ethnicity is or my race, then I do tell them. But really, I just want to encourage you guys to be yourself. You know, like if you feel like you are experiencing someone who is racially against you or not fond of you, or you're not giving them the right, what they think to be the right answer, just know how you want to respond. Ming, anybody else?
Jaren here. So I talked about how I was from New York, from Long Island. That's the answer I would give. I would just tell them I'm from New York until they clarify their question. If they're really asking, then if they're really digging, I'll tell them it's none of their business. Okay, it really depends. But if they're digging into me with question after question, I would say I'm just here to take this workshop. I mean, this has no connection to the reason we're here. I would answer that with New York first, and then I would bluntly respond to them. But it really depends. That question though. Ooh.
Okay, this is Ming here. So we have 2 more questions left. We're about to run out of time. And so the next question is, with saving face, how do you not try to save face? Like if people don't accept your culture or identity, then how do you prevent yourself from saving face?
This is Jane here. I think that's really tough to just stop. Like I said again, the important discussion is to dialogue and try and understand our culture as it relates to saving face. But completely stop. I mean, I feel like it's ingrained into our Asian culture with bringing it here to America from other countries. I mean, that's just what has happened. But to completely remove it is just not possible. But being able to be ourselves and understand our culture is really important, and it's to completely remove it just for the sake of being the same or assimilating, I don't think is right. But to adjust and be able to dialogue about it, that's what's important.
Go ahead, Jaren.
Jaren here, yeah. It really. Okay, so there's a standard that a person has that they receive from society, from the community that they were born and raised in. So if you stop that, that means you're asking this person to stop being Asian. And that doesn't really work well. And we just have to figure out a way to work with those who don't really fit the mold. If they're deaf, okay, I don't really fit the narrative that much. But, going back, but that could be an issue that there aren't resources within the home country, but there are here. So it's a matter of having to be flexible. But in terms of being from an immigrant family and not having access to English, that could be a big factor. So we just have to have a good opportunity to negotiate the culture from home and how to adapt that to your needs here in the States. And there's not a lot of Asian deaf discussion, but if it became more mainstream, sharing stories and what happened at home, training, things like that, things would be better.
This is Darian. I just want to add one more thing. I agree. Because to stop that concept of saving face isn't a good idea. It's almost like thinking about like ways to manage it and not quite stop it, but maybe use it less. And so I recommend researching maybe why it happens, and especially like figure out the imposter imposter syndrome and racism, and looking into specific situations as to why you tend to save face, and those could possibly help you too. And this is Ming. Wow, what an incredible discussion. And so we do have a lot more questions, and unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for asking those. I would love to stay much longer, but we're unable to. I just want to thank you guys again for coming. And the most important thing is we do want to thank the people who had hosted this event. That was Christine Page. Thank you. Yay. And also, I want to thank our BTS people, our behind the scenes people. Our first one is Leo Samingo. Guys, there are four of them, Ida, and the interpreters. And so thank you, Bernita. Thank you, David, our interpreters, and thank you, Carrie, our other 3 interpreters. And then also I want to thank our captioner, Cindy Hines. And thank you guys so much. We just also want to give thanks to our 3 panelists, Jane, Jaren, and Darian. Thank you so much for being here. And we're thrilled to have this type of a discussion. And I hope that you guys were all able to enjoy it. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.